Hi and welcome to this lesson on Remains by Armitage, Simon Armitage. He's very often just called Armitage by modern people because he's a very famous poet. So this one is a really interesting poem. It's one of the most modern poems in the collection, and yeah, I really like it. It's very clever, I think. It's got a lot to it. It's very simple on the surface, so it's not a hard one to start with and to kind of get used to. But then if you want to be really complex and write a really high level essay, you can go deeper into it. So I'm going to try and give you a sense of that doubleness of the simple surface and then the deeper kind of analysis that you can get underneath what's going on there. So I've written this as a kind of compressed summary because I think it's important that the entire thing is a single anecdote. You might want to write the word anecdote down. It means a personal story that tells an example of something. So in this context, the speaker of the poem is telling an example anecdote about his life as a soldier that he thinks expresses, what the types of things that he had to encounter and the way he had to be as a soldier. So I'll just go through what he says then. He says, another time we get sent out to deal with people who are looting a bank, and one of them runs off as fast as he can up the road. Probably he's carrying a gun, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else and another person, we're all thinking the same, so all three of us start shooting. 3 people acting as one, and I swear, I see every bullet as it rips through his life. I see a hole in his body with daylight coming through from the other side. So we've shot this looter at least 12 times and he's lying here on the ground, kind of inside out, with his guts hanging out of his body. He's the image of pain itself, of complete agony. One of my friends walks up to him and picks up his guts and throws them back into his body. Then the dead guy is taken away in the back of a lorry. A lorry is kind of like a truck. That's the end of the story, except it isn't really the end. The stain left by the looter's blood stays on the street, and when I'm out patrolling, I walk over it week after week, and then I'm sent back home on leave from work. But I blink, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. When I sleep, he's there again, probably armed, possibly not. And when I drink and take drugs, it doesn't flush out the memories or the guilt of him. He's here in my head when I close my eyes. Dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in a distant, sun-stunned, sand-covered land, or buried in a coffin under the desert sand. He's close to the bone, here and now. His bloody life is in my bloody hands. So notice that word bloody ending the ideas of the poem there, being repeated, but I think also being used differently. In some ways, a swear word because he's so upset by the fact that he can't get over this murder. So it's an interesting poem. Like I say, quite simple to start with. There's a guy who's a soldier. He's with 2 other guys. They're told to protect a bank that's been kind of blown open. And some guy comes and tries to steal money from it. And because they're told to protect the bank, they shoot him. So they're just doing their jobs. They're all of the same mind, he says. They're all thinking the same way, and they all know that that's their training. But after he's done it, he starts to question whether it was a good thing to do, whether it made sense to shoot and kill someone because they were stealing money. They weren't hurting anyone. They probably weren't a criminal in a normal situation. They were just taking advantage of the bank being blown open. So, yeah, really interesting questions here. The training of a soldier versus their personal morals and ethics. There's always things that you have to do as a soldier that you might not personally agree with, and you're trained to not rely on your instincts or your thoughts and to just do what you're told in that moment from your training and from your superiors. And in some ways that keeps a lot of order and stability to the armed forces, but in another way, it has the effect of doing what it did to this guy here who tells the story, and it basically plagues him because he feels like he wasn't acting as himself in that moment, yet somehow he's responsible for the death of that man, and not only the death, but the kind of undignified treatment of his body after death. So yeah, there's no indication whether the other soldiers were affected in this way as well, like whether it was just that this guy particularly is really sensitive, or whether they're all really plagued by the looter. Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's quite a brutal, sort of violent story, as you can imagine. It kind of needs to be for the poem to have its kind of powerful effect that it does. I like stanza 5, there's a shift in tone here. That's the end of the story, except not really. I think he just says end of story, except not really. So it sounds clear and straightforward, but it's not. Seems like it's just a one-off thing, but it's not. It's actually something that stays with him his entire life up to the moment where he's telling this story to us. So hopefully you feel quite confident with the main ideas of the poem, and you feel quite like it's straightforward, but also like it's complex, and you can say something deep about it. It's not just basic in your mind. I'm actually going to really quickly just go to context, because this is very important. So there's this guy who does an interview for a documentary that the poet Armitage makes called The Not Dead, which is about soldiers who didn't die in war and their experiences post-war of, what they went through and how they cope now with what they had to do or what happened to them during war. And there's this guy called Guardsman Tromans. So Guardsman is his title. He's a guard, and his surname is Tromans. And he is one of the interviewees in this poem, and he's telling the story. He tells it in a really honest, quite emotional, plain voice, in really simple language, in quite a clear way, but in a tragic way where you can tell it's affected him. You can tell he's a really intelligent guy, and probably too intelligent for the type of task that he was given, I think, is one of the problems that he had personally. So he's a member of the National Guard, and he's in this documentary. And he says that when he was young, he grew up with images of war on TV, and he thought that it was heroic and noble, and that's why he joined the army. And then the reality of it was very, very different from what he thought it would be like when he saw it on TV. And it left him with a permanent trauma that turned him to alcohol and drugs as coping mechanisms. He talks about being really panicked by the moment of war, and then having a 24 hours a day stress or kind of anxiety as if you're going to die any second. And then when he returned, the place that he came from is not the kind of place where you talk about your feelings, especially if you're a man or a soldier. So he was really impacted by this, but he didn't feel like he could get counseling or help for how, what he'd been through and how it affected him. He thought it was somehow weak. So again, that was a kind of part of his decision to turn to alcohol and drugs. So yeah, really sad, quite a powerful story, mainly I think because it's so real. It's based on a real man, single man, with his own real experiences as an individual soldier. It's a very personal, individual poem. Some of the collection has a lot more kind of collective poetry about soldiers in general, or war in general. This one is very individual. So we'll go back now that you know who the speaker is, we'll go back to the speaker. So it's supposed to be a soldier who's talking. I think in some ways Armitage wants to respect this topic. He was never a soldier himself. So he's using a persona, a character, to speak from. But that persona is actually real. It's a man who was interviewed, so Guardsman Tromans. So one of the main things with this poem is make sure that you analyze it that way, that you have this sense of it's told from the point of view of a real person who is turned sort of into a character in Armitage's poem, like a persona. So you'll notice in the lines of the poem, sometimes it seems very realistic and conversational. And that's because that language is almost directly lifted from the interview. And sometimes it feels a bit more poetic and symbolic. And for me, that's more when Armitage is putting his own spin on it, his own kind of take on the language. So you might notice slight subtle shifts in tone or style between the lines and images of this poem. So it's first person, and he talks about I. It's anecdotal, as I was saying before. Sorry. Trying to highlight that one. Anecdote. But he uses we a lot as well, and especially when he's talking about the act where he commits murder. He says there's three of us, we were all of the same mind, and we all shot him. It's not really possible to know which one was the one that actually caused his death because they all did together. You might want to look up firing squads and the psychology behind firing squads if you're interested in this. So a common way to execute people in the past was death by firing squad, and the idea is that you have a row of men with guns and they all shoot at the person at the same time. So the person dies, but no one individually feels responsible. And psychologically, it's thought to be a way to kind of protect the minds of those individuals because they feel like they're not responsible because loads of people were shooting. And, it does work in some extent. But obviously with this guy, Guardsman Tromond, he still feels responsible. There's something unresolved there about this moment. He is trained to be a soldier. This is his whole life's kind of work and his dream. And then the reality of it is physically too much for him to sort of cope with. So quite interesting, that difference between what he thought it would be like and then how it was when he got to that moment.